entire squad of young cheerleaders from Arizona vanished in 1995 after their routine, disappearing without a trace and leaving only shattered dreams and anguished parents in their wake, until 2 decades later, when a lone hiker stumbled upon something astonishing deep in the desert, a find that would upend everything and unearth a chilling truth. Morning light poured through the kitchen windows, painting golden rectangles over the breakfast table where Marissa Green sat beside her husband, David. Another routine morning in Chandler, Arizona, or at least it had been the same since the day their twin daughters, April and Amber, faded into thin air. Marissa stirred her coffee absently, memories drifting to the girls who would now be 34. What paths might they have walked? Would they have children of their own? Such questions haunted her every waking moment, yet she'd learned, reluctantly, to live alongside the unknown. Then her phone buzzed, jolting her back to the present, and she froze. Detective Holbrook flashed on the screen. David's hand trembled as Marissa whispered the name, a name long buried under 20 years of dead ends. He set down his mug and urged her, "Answer it." Heart hammering, she tapped "accept" and placed the call on speaker, her breath catching as the detective's calm voice crackled through. "I hope I'm not disturbing your morning." "Not at all," Marissa managed, though every nerve in her body was alight with anticipation. "Is it about the girls?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "We've had a breakthrough," Detective Holbrook replied, his tone guarded but urgent. "I can't explain everything over the phone. Could you and your husband come to the station as soon as possible?" David nodded before she could speak, promising, "We'll be there right away." And just like that, they abandoned their half-eaten breakfast, Marissa snatching her purse and David grabbing the keys, their car rolling out of the driveway within minutes under the warming desert sun. As they drove toward the Chandler Police Department, Marissa gazed at the city's new skyline, towering buildings and widened highways that their daughters would never recognize. "I never thought we'd hear from him again," David murmured, knuckles white on the wheel. "Me neither," she replied, fighting back tears. Pulling into a crowded parking lot, they spotted other familiar cars, vehicles belonging to the parents of the missing squad members, and Marissa's pulse spiked. Inside the station, the sterile scent of coffee and cleaners greeted them as they were led to a conference room, where 4 other sets of parents sat, faces etched with the same ache. Detective Holbrook, now grayer and wearier than when he'd first taken their case, stood before them. "Thank you for coming," he began, voice steady but solemn. "Early this morning, a hiker deep in the Sonoran Desert uncovered something we believe is linked to your daughter's disappearance." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over them, before turning to his laptop and revealing a discovery that would finally shatter 20 years of silence. The detective tapped a few keys, and a photograph filled the wall screen, an old, rusted metal suitcase, half buried beneath a flat stone in the desert sand. Its lid was cracked open, revealing a pile of red and white fabric inside. The room fell silent until Susan Collins gasped, hand to her mouth, "Cheerleading uniforms." Marissa leaned in, her heart pounding as her eyes scanned the screen. The colors were faded, dulled by time and dust, but she recognized them instantly. They were identical to the ones April and Amber wore the night they vanished. Detective Holbrook's voice broke the silence. The hiker who found it was walking with his dog in a remote part of the Sonoran Desert, far from any known trail. The dog picked up a scent and began digging. That's when they uncovered the suitcase. David's voice was steady, but Marissa could see the storm behind his eyes. "Where exactly?" he asked. The detective clicked to another image, a wide, desolate landscape surrounding the site. "About 30 miles outside Chandler. We've already dispatched a forensic team." Marissa sat up straighter. "I want to go there. I need to see it." She surprised even herself with the urgency in her voice. Around the table, the other parents nodded, murmuring in agreement. "Please," said Linda Thompson, barely holding back tears. "After 20 years of silence, we need this." Holbrook hesitated. "I'll check with the field team." He stepped out, leaving the room buzzing with quiet speculation. But Marissa wasn't listening. Her thoughts spun wildly. Why now? Why would someone bury those uniforms now? Minutes later, the detective returned. "They've cleared it. You can visit the site, but you'll need to stay behind the tape and follow all instructions." Relief swept through the room. "Thank you," David said, already standing. "We'll follow your lead." The group left the station in a silent procession, 5 cars following Holbrook's unmarked vehicle out of Chandler and into the desert, the city slowly melting into dry earth and pale brush. Marissa stared out the window, her mind replaying the last night she saw her daughters. April and Amber had been so full of joy after winning second place at a regional cheerleading competition. They called that night, giddy with excitement, promising to call again on the way home. That call never came. By the time the convoy reached the desert site, the sun was directly overhead, casting stark shadows on the cracked terrain. They parked beside a cluster of police vehicles and followed Holbrook on foot for half a mile through the scorching heat. A white tent had been set up at the site, bordered by yellow crime scene tape. Officers moved carefully, documenting every detail. Off to the side stood a man with a dog. "That's Chris Delaney," Holbrook said, "the man who found the suitcase. And that's Dusty, his dog." Chris looked to be in his early 40s, his skin weathered, his eyes kind. "I wish we were meeting under different circumstances," he said, as he shook hands with each parent. "Thank you for what you did," Marissa told him, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to us." Chris nodded softly. "Dusty deserves the credit. He caught the scent and wouldn't stop digging." The dog, a bright-eyed mix of Australian Shepherd and Labrador, sat calmly at Chris's side. "Can we see it?" David asked. Holbrook nodded and led them under the tent. There, resting on a folding table, was the suitcase. Marissa's breath caught. The uniforms were folded neatly inside, though age and the desert had left their mark. A forensic technician addressed the group. "Based on the wear and soil analysis, we believe the items were buried recently, maybe within the past year." "Recently?" Peter Rivera echoed, stunned. "But our daughters vanished 20 years ago." The room fell quiet again, because that, right there, was the terrifying part. "It's so unusual," Detective Holbrook admitted, squatting beside the shallow grave and running a finger along the edge of the stone cover. "Whoever hid these uniforms must have been in a rush. The burial was barely concealing them." The parents clustered around the table, eyes fixed on the faded red and white fabric that might finally chart a path to their daughters. In the distance, vehicles stirred dust on the desert floor, a news van bearing a local station's logo, and a dark sedan whose driver stepping out made Marissa's heart leap. Vincent Carraway, the girl's former coach, strode forward with that same purposeful gait she remembered, albeit slowed by silver at his temples. "Marissa, David," he called, voice steady despite 2 decades of weight on his shoulders. Holbrook greeted him with a nod. "Coach, thanks for coming so quickly." "My girls," Carraway said simply. "I'd drop everything for them." Holbrook turned to the group. "We're going public with this discovery. 20 years ago, this community mobilized to find those girls. People deserve to know we've made progress." Reporters began unpacking cameras and mics nearby as Carraway approached the suitcase. Staring down at the uniforms, he murmured, "After all this time, I still hoped we'd find them." He then thanked Chris Delaney, dusty from the hike, yet composed, for his dog's persistence. Dusty, the Australian Shepherd Lab mix, watched calmly from his leash. Moving among the parents, Carraway offered a gentle handshake, pausing at Marissa and David. His gaze softened. "It's been a long road. How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected," David said, gripping Marissa's hand. Before their conversation could deepen, a reporter approached with cameraman and sound technician in tow. "We'd like to interview the parents," she asked Detective Holbrook. He nodded. "One at a time, please, and keep it brief." When it was their turn, Marissa and David faced the lens, hands clasped for strength. "Mrs. Green, after 20 years, what does this lead mean to you?" the reporter asked. Marissa inhaled deeply. "It's overwhelming. We've never stopped searching or hoping. If April and Amber are out there watching, know we will find you. Mr. Green, what do you wish for most now?" "Closure," David replied, voice calm though his grip on Marissa's hand trembled. "But above all, we pray they're alive and we can bring them home." After the cameras packed up, Marissa realized her water bottle and camera lay forgotten in the car. "I need to grab them," she told David. He fell in step beside her as they informed Holbrook of their plan. "Stay on the path," he warned gently. "It's easy to get lost out here." Under the blazing sun, the desert shimmered. Marissa's gaze drifted across the horizon to a dusty ridge where a truck lingered. Two figures moved, one bent over as if lifting something heavy, the other crouched behind a cactus. "David," she whispered, grasping his arm. "Look there." Marissa's eyes narrowed against the glare of the afternoon sun as she focused on the distant ridge where two figures moved near a dusty pickup truck. Her pulse quickened. "David, look," she whispered, pointing. "See that truck? And there's someone crouching by those rocks." David raised a hand above his eyes, scanning the horizon. "Probably off-roaders taking a rest," he suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Maybe they stopped for shade." But Marissa's instincts buzzed like an alarm. Why haul a heavy sack out here, away from any trail? And what was the other man doing with that shovel? Without a second thought, she broke from the worn path and headed straight toward the figures. "Marissa," David hissed urgently as he caught up with her, skidding to a halt in the loose sand. "Detective Holbrook said to stay on the marked route." She shot him a determined glance. "I can't just stand here. We need to know what they're hiding." Before he could argue further, the two men noticed their approach. One man abandoned the shovel and sprinted to the truck's bed, throwing the bulky sack inside. The other hurtled over a cluster of rocks, clutching something in his hand. Both men clambered into the cab, and the engine roared to life. The truck lurched forward, sending up a towering plume of dust as it tore down the wash and vanished beyond a dune. "They ran," Marissa called breathlessly. Through the swirling haze, she glimpsed a small decal on the rear window, a company logo, dark against the pale glass. Fumbling for her phone, she managed a blurry snapshot before the dust swallowed the truck completely. David took the phone, studied the indistinct image, then turned to Marissa. "I think that logo could lead us somewhere." Driven by a mix of dread and hope, Marissa pressed on toward the spot where the men had been digging. The ground was freshly disturbed. Soft sand piled around a shallow depression, eerily reminiscent of the burial site under the tent. She and David dropped to their knees, sweeping away loose grains. "David," she said, her voice catching. He leaned in, brushing sand aside with gentle fingers, and withdrew a small, tarnished object. Marissa's breath hitched as he handed it to her. The piece of jewelry glinted faintly, a tiny silver star set with a once vibrant red gemstone. Recognition flooded her. "Amber's earring," she whispered, clutching the star. "I gave these to them for their 13th birthday." Tears pooled in her eyes. After 20 years, this could be the first real trace. David stood, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We need to tell Detective Holbrook, now." They sprinted back toward the white tent, where Holbrook and a forensic technician were comparing notes. Other parents clustered in small groups, some speaking softly with officers, others staring at the desert floor with haunted expressions. "Detective!" Marissa called urgently, raising her voice enough to cut through the background hum. Holbrook looked up, his face paling when he saw the earring held aloft in her trembling hand. "What have you found?" he asked, stepping forward. David handed the earring to him and explained in tight bursts. We saw 3 men with a truck, one lugging a sack, another digging by the rocks. They fled when they spotted us. We went to that exact spot and uncovered this." Holbrook turned the earring over between his fingertips, every line on his face deepening. "You went half a mile off the designated area?" Marissa nodded, voice firm despite her racing heart. "We had to. This isn't just any trinket. This is our daughter's." The detective tucked the earring into an evidence bag. "This changes everything. If these men were here, they may have been the ones who hid the uniforms, or worse." He sighed and straightened, scanning the horizon as if willing the truck to reappear. "We're going to need full descriptions. That logo, anything you remember, and we'll secure this area further. No one leaves until we have more answers." As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Marissa felt the weight of 2 decades easing just enough to allow a flicker of hope. For the first time in 20 years, she believed they were on the path to finding April and Amber, or at least uncovering what had happened to them in this vast, unforgiving wilderness. Detective Holbrook's voice cut through the desert heat. "After spotting those 3 men in such a remote location, do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" David swallowed hard, meeting the detective's gaze. "We know, sir. But we couldn't just let them drive off without investigating." Marissa's jaw tightened. "They may be the ones who buried the suitcase. Now that they know the police have been here all morning, they could be heading back to destroy other evidence." Behind them, the other parents hurried over, drawn by the urgency in Marissa's tone. Vincent Carraway pushed through the small group, his face pale. "What's happening?" he asked, glancing between Marissa and the detective. Holbrook held up the small evidence bag. "The Greens found this earring near the spot where they saw 3 suspicious men." He turned it so Carraway could see. "Mrs. Green believes it belonged to her daughter, Amber." Carraway's eyes widened as he recognized the tiny silver star. "That does look like the earrings the girls used to wear." "Did you get a clear look at those men?" Holbrook pressed, looking back to Marissa and David. "It was too far to see their faces," Marissa admitted. "But I remember one of them wore a distinctive patch on his truck's rear window, some kind of company logo." David produced the blurry photo from Marissa's phone. "I tried to capture it, but it's not very clear." The detective frowned. "Can you sketch the logo from memory?" He handed Marissa a notepad and pen. Despite her reluctance, "I'm not much of an artist." She concentrated, drawing a stylized bird, wings splayed around the letters CPF. Linda Thompson, listening close by, suddenly gasped. "CPF, that must be Carraway Performance and Fitness." All eyes turned to Coach Carraway, whose expression remained carefully neutral. "Carraway Performance and Fitness?" Holbrook repeated, eyebrow raised. Carraway held up his hands in calm explanation. "My company sponsored the cheerleading squad 20 years ago and funded much of the search thereafter. We were fully transparent with the original investigation." "That checks out," Holbrook said, addressing the assembled parents. "Coach Carraway's business was vetted at the time. They provided money and volunteers when the official search wound down." He looked back at Marissa and David. "Did you note a license plate number?" David shook his head. "No plate, or it was missing or obscured." The detective made another note, suspicious in itself. He turned to Michael Lee, another parent who'd been sketching. Michael held up his version of the logo, uncannily similar to Marissa's. "Yes," Marissa confirmed. "That matches my memory of the patch." Carraway studied the drawing, brow furrowed. "I sold that company about 20 years ago, shortly before the girls disappeared," he explained. "I stayed on as a consultant for a while under the new owner, a businessman named Matthew Rands, which is why I was still linked to CPF during the early searches. But I've had no official ties to them in nearly 2 decades. "I'll need the sale documents and Mr. Rands's contact information," Holbrook said, nodding as he added another note. Caraway readily agreed, promising to provide everything. Turning back to the Greens, the detective said, "Show me exactly where you saw those men and where you found the earring." David pointed down the dusty wash. "It's about half a mile from here. I'd like to check for tire tracks." "If they fled in a hurry, they may have left a trail," Holbrook agreed. "I'll dispatch a team to follow up, but for your safety, you two need to remain here or return to the station." Marissa opened her mouth to object, but David gently squeezed her arm. After a moment, she sighed. "Could we at least watch from a distance?" Holbrook considered them, then relented. "You may wait at the base camp we've set up, but that's as far as you go. Understood?" They nodded, and the detective gathered his officers to head out. As he did, Chris Delaney approached with Dusty at his heels. "I know this landscape well," Chris offered. "I can guide your team." Holbrook shook his head firmly. "We're fine, Chris. Thank you." He turned back to his team. "Let's move out." As the officers fanned out, Marissa and David stood together near the tent, the afternoon sun painting long shadows across the hard earth. In Marissa's hand glinted Amber's earring, proof that, 20 years on, the desert was still whispering its secrets. And now, for the first time, someone was listening. Detective Holbrook gave a firm nod as Chris Delaney offered his help. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Delaney, but we can't involve civilians at this stage." The hiker's shoulders relaxed in understanding. "Of course," he said quietly. Marissa reached out and touched his arm. "Thank you again, Chris, and Dusty, too. Without you, we might never have known." Chris managed a small, reassuring smile, then stepped back as an officer approached to escort the Greens and the other parents back to the base camp. Marissa gently passed Amber's earring to Detective Holbrook, who slipped it into an evidence bag with gloved hands. "We'll find out what happened to your daughters," he promised. His gaze locked on hers, one way or another. Marissa gave a small nod, determined yet terrified at the same time. 20 years of waiting, and now with this tiny, star-shaped earring in official custody, hope felt both exhilarating and fragile. David guided Marissa toward the convoy of SUVs waiting in the rough clearing. "We should eat something," he murmured, knowing they needed to keep their strength. 20 years of anguish had hollowed them out. They could scarcely admit hunger, but he was right. Not far off, a single neon open sign buzzed above a dusty diner, flanked by a gas station and a general store. They climbed into the back of a utility vehicle and rattled down the dirt road toward civilization. Inside the diner, the air was cool and dim after the glaring sunlight outside. They settled into a vinyl booth in the corner, watching locals sip coffee at the counter beneath a faded jukebox. A friendly waitress appeared with fresh pots of coffee and menus. "Afternoon, folks," she greeted, pouring them refills. "Take your time." David ordered a club sandwich. Marissa chose chicken noodle soup. They sat in heavy silence until the waitress retreated. Marissa finally spoke, voice hushed. "I still can't believe we found Amber's earring here after all this time. It can't be coincidence." David wrapped his hands around his mug. "I know, but let's let the police work it. Those men were dangerous." Marissa's gaze hardened. "But what if the police miss something? What if those guys know where April and Amber are? We can't wait for answers. We have to follow every lead ourselves." David squeezed her hand gently. "Rushing back into the desert could ruin everything. Holbrook has the training and resources we don't." Marissa's eyes flashed with pain. "It took a hiker and his dog to find that suitcase. The police didn't even discover it. Does that inspire confidence?" Before either could respond, the waitress returned with their meals. As she set down the plates, Marissa noticed something that made her heart stop. The woman wore a star-shaped earring set with a red gem, identical to the one in Marissa's hand. "Excuse me," Marissa said, voice trembling. "Where did you get those earrings?" The waitress touched one self-consciously. "Oh, this old thing. A customer gave it to me years ago because it matched my eyes. Lost the other one, though. He said he'd chase me down with it, but never did." David leaned forward casually. "Was he a local?" The waitress nodded. "Not sure, but he'd stop in now and then. Always tipped well." She pointed toward a corkboard behind the counter, cluttered with Polaroids of regular patrons. "He's on the customer wall somewhere." With a polite smile, the waitress hurried away. Marissa turned to David, her breath catching. "Let's look." Together, they rose and approached the photo-covered board, scanning dozens of faces. Tourists, truckers, mechanics, searching for any sign of the mysterious man who might hold the missing half of that earring, and perhaps the key to their daughter's fate. Marissa and David exchanged a furtive look as the waitress slipped behind the counter. The hum of the diner's refrigerator and the soft clink of dishes seemed impossibly loud in Marissa's ears. She took a steadying breath and watched the waitress disappear into the kitchen. Moments later, she and David rose and settled the bill, every second stretching taut with anticipation. Outside, the sun had dipped slightly, tinting the sky a bruised orange. Dust swirled in lazy spirals off the gravel parking lot as they climbed into their car. David started the engine, his hand trembling slightly on the wheel. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked softly. Marissa tightened her grip on the steering wheel. "Yes. If Gerald Laffinger has answers, if he was connected to those men in the desert, we have to know." They waited a few minutes for the waitress to re-emerge onto the sidewalk, a stack of insulated delivery bags cradled in her arms. She glanced around nervously, then stepped behind the wheel of her battered pickup truck. Marissa fell in behind her at a safe distance, making sure not to draw attention. Her headlights dimmed to avoid startling the delivery driver. The little convoy crept out of town along the narrow two-lane highway. Beyond the last outlying houses, the landscape flattened, punctuated only by the silhouetted forms of saguaros and mesquite. Dust devils danced in the waning light. Marissa's pulse pounded as she followed the waitress's truck, her eyes flicking between the rear window and her rearview mirror. David sat beside her, phone in hand, ready to call Detective Holbrook at the first inkling of trouble. After about 20 minutes, the waitress turned onto a dirt track marked by a faded sign reading Laffinger Ranch, the peeling paint half obscured by overgrown weeds. Marissa's breath caught. She eased the car forward, careful to maintain a quarter-mile buffer. The pickup rumbled into a clearing where a low, sprawling farmhouse sat under the vast desert sky. A handful of outbuildings, barns, corrals, a weather-beaten feed shed clustered around it. Marissa watched as the waitress pulled up beside a locked gate and began unloading the delivery bags. Two men emerged from the house, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other lean, with a creased baseball cap pulled low. They greeted the waitress with casual familiarity, handshakes, a shoulder pat, before lifting the bags into the back of a dusty SUV parked in the yard. David leaned forward, whispering, "There, those two men. Do you recognize them?" Marissa's heart lurched. The taller man's face was turned toward her car for just a second. Sharp cheekbones, a square jaw, eyes that flicked back to the pickup driver. They were the same build and profile she'd glimpsed in the desert, dragging that heavy sack. "Yes," she breathed, eyes fixed. "That's him." She reached for her phone. "I'm calling Detective Holbrook right now." As she dialed, the woman in the pickup paused, glancing over her shoulder with the faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes. Marissa's chest tightened. She gave a barely perceptible nod, as if to say, "It's okay, thank you." David held the line open. "We have them, Detective," he said when the field officer answered. "Laffinger Ranch. Two men matching your descriptions loading what looks like evidence into an SUV. We need you here, now." Marissa shut off the engine and reached for her husband's hand, her pulse finally beginning to slow. The sun sank lower, fiery on the horizon, as they sat in tense silence, hope and dread woven together, as the distant rumble of police vehicles grew nearer down the deserted ranch road. The interior of Lavender Ranch was immaculately maintained, with manicured lawns stretching out on either side of a long, winding drive. As the gates swung closed behind them, Marissa and David found themselves ushered into the back of a darkened SUV, the three men flanking the doors ensuring they could move nowhere. The vehicle's leather seats were cool against the heat of the desert afternoon, and the faint hum of air conditioning did little to ease the tension that coiled in Marissa's stomach. Through the tinted windows, they caught brief glimpses of the sprawling property: whitewashed buildings with flower-lined porches, a cluster of stables where horses stamped impatiently in their stalls, and a distant row of lavender fields that gave the ranch its name. Yet even this pastoral scene felt menacing now. Every shadow seemed to harbor hidden watchers, and the sweet scent of blossoms felt faintly oppressive. The SUV lurched forward, tires crunching over gravel, and pulled into a courtyard enclosed by low stone walls. A uniformed guard at a small kiosk nodded curtly as the driver relayed a few words into a handset. Moments later, another gate swung open, revealing a courtyard paved in flagstone. They were directed to exit the vehicle and led, still bound by invisible authority, into a cool foyer whose marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Marissa's pulse thundered in her ears as the men silently prodded them down a wide hallway. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow the couple's every move. At the end of the corridor, they entered a small, brightly lit office. A heavy desk stood between them and a pair of leather chairs where a tall figure sat, backlit by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the lavender rows. "Welcome," said the man behind the desk in a calm, measured voice. He was neatly dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair flecked with silver. Marissa realized with a shock that this must be Gerald Laffinger himself. He steepled his fingers as he regarded them without expression. "I understand you have questions," David swallowed. "Yes, sir. We believe you, or someone connected to you, might have information about our daughters, who disappeared from a cheerleading competition 20 years ago." Laffinger's eyes glinted as he leaned forward. "Is that so?" He tapped a folder on his desk, and one of the guards removed the earring from its evidence bag, placing it atop the polished wood. "You found this on my property?" Marissa took a shaky breath. "It was buried in the desert nearby. We traced suspicious activity back here." She glanced at the shining star-shaped earring. "That belonged to my daughter, Amber." He nodded slowly, as if weighing the moment. "I didn't bury it," he said quietly, "but I'll explain why it ended up here, and at last, perhaps you'll know the truth." As the guards closed the door behind them, Marissa exchanged a hopeful, terrified glance with David. Finally, in this ornate ranch office, under the gaze of the man who had held their fate in his hands, they might uncover what had really happened to April and Amber all those years ago. The bunker was cavernous, its industrial lighting casting a harsh glow across rows of metal shelves stocked with crates and cans of what looked like non-perishable supplies: canned beans, bottled water, medical kits, enough to sustain dozens of people for months. Along one wall, narrow cots with military-style blankets were lined up in neat rows, each with a small locker at its foot. The air was cool and smelled faintly of concrete and antiseptic. Marissa's breath caught in her throat as she took in the scene. This was no makeshift hideaway. It was a purpose-built facility. How many others had come here? How many of the missing girls, she wondered, had ever seen this place? Beside her, David's face was ashen, every line etched with disbelief. One of the captors shoved David toward a cluster of cots. "Sit," he barked. Marissa hesitated only a moment before forcing herself to comply, sinking onto the thin mattress with a muffled cry of pain at the springs beneath. The man closed the heavy metal door, the click of its lock echoing down the corridor. Left alone in that subterranean chamber, Marissa and David shared a single moment of terrified silence. Then Marissa stood, pressing her palm against the concrete wall. "David," she whispered, voice trembling. "This is where they kept them." He nodded, eyes fixed on the dim corridor outside their door. "We have to stay calm and find a way out," he replied, reaching into his pocket and instantly recoiling at the emptiness. His phone was gone, along with everything else. Somewhere deeper in the bunker, heavy footsteps approached. The door swung open again to reveal Gerald Laffinger, flanked by two imposing guards. He carried himself with cold authority, his tailored suit incongruous in this grim subterranean world. "You wanted answers," he said softly, crossing his arms. "I can tell you exactly what happened, but you must understand, some truths are more dangerous than these walls." Marissa swallowed hard, her voice firm despite the tremor. "We're ready," she said. "We've waited 20 years. Laffinger's lips curved in a thin smile. "Very well." He motioned to the guard by the door. "Bring them in." And as the guard stepped back, revealing a second corridor lined with numbered doors, Marissa realized that this was only the beginning of the dark revelation they had so desperately sought. April's hands trembled as she loosened the final knot, her fingers awkward but determined from disuse. Marissa threw her arms around her daughter, her tears soaking April's dusty shirt. David pressed forward and embraced April as well, his body racked with silent sobs. The other two women, Kira Thompson and Hannah Lee, rose hesitantly and joined the embrace, forming a circle of desperate relief amid the bunker's concrete walls. Marissa pulled back, cupping April's face in her hands. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered, voice breaking. "We're getting you out of here." April's eyes were hollow yet bright with a flicker of hope. "Mom, Dad," she choked out, "we thought no one would ever find us." She glanced at Kira and Hannah, who looked between Marissa and David as if seeking permission to believe. David shook his head, disbelieving. "You're alive. That's all that matters." He turned to the other survivors. "And you, Kira, Hannah, you too." Kira's lips trembled. "Thank you," she said, voice hoarse. "April risked everything to help us. None of us would have made it without her." April swallowed hard. "The first few years, they let us believe they'd forgotten. But then they moved us here, deeper underground." She pointed to the supply shelves. "We survived on rationed food and water, sneakily stealing supplies when guards weren't watching." She paused, gaze drifting to the door. "We lost Rachel to infection, no medicine. And Amber," her voice caught, and she looked away. "Amber and Lily tried to organize a real escape. They were caught. I begged for mercy, but they—" She trailed off, eyes haunted. Marissa's hand flew to her mouth as David closed his eyes in anguish. Kira laid a gentle hand on April's arm. "It wasn't your fault. None of you deserved this." Hannah nodded, tears glinting. "We kept going because April wouldn't let us give up." April drew strength from their solidarity and met her mother's gaze. "There are other rooms, deeper down, but they won't let us leave." She looked pleadingly at Laffinger's locked door. "You have to get us out before they know we're free." Marissa's resolve hardened. "We will," she vowed. "We'll bring help. Detective Holbrook is on his way." She turned to David. "Find a way to jam that lock. April, show us how it's done." April led them to the electronic keypad, explaining its vulnerabilities. As they crouched together under flickering lights, forging a plan, the distant hum of guards above reminded them of the urgency. Outside, a sliver of daylight slipped across the concrete floor, a promise that rescue was close and that these walls would not hold them forever. The courtyard outside Lavender Ranch had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos by the time Marissa, David, and April were escorted toward the waiting police cruisers. Uniformed officers moved with purpose among the waxed patina of SUVs and ambulances, their radios crackling with updates. Sheets covered the bodies of the 3 men who had resisted arrest. and a perimeter of yellow tape cordoned off the area around the main house, where forensic teams were collecting evidence. Marissa's heart pounded as she drew April close, keeping her daughter between herself and David, an unspoken promise that they would never again be separated. Chris Delaney stood nearby, his dog Dusty at heel, and even the diner waitress's face appeared in the throng of onlookers, her relief plain in her wide eyes. Detective Holbrook was directing traffic, barking orders into his radio and conferring with ambulance crews. When he spotted the Greens and April emerging from the barn, he hurried over, his expression cracking into a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. "Mrs. Green, Mr. Green," he began, his voice thick. "Are you all right?" "We've found April, and Kira and Hannah, too," Marissa said, tears spilling down her cheeks. But the others didn't make it." Her voice trembled with raw grief. Holbrook's face darkened. He motioned to a nearby officer. "Notify the morgue and arrange for next of kin notifications immediately." Then, turning back to David, he asked, "You said Caraway is responsible?" David gripped the detective's arm. "He kidnapped them 20 years ago. He's been holding them prisoner all this time, using them for God knows what." Holbrook nodded curtly. "We interviewed Caraway at the station earlier. He's the prime suspect in these abductions. I'm putting out an all-points bulletin for him. Block every exit, search every property associated with him. He's armed and extremely dangerous." A squad car roared past, sirens echoing off the ranch's whitewashed walls. Paramedics approached April, Kira, and Hannah with stretchers and medical kits, checking for malnutrition, dehydration, and any signs of long-term abuse. Marissa held April's hand tightly, refusing to let go, her own body trembling from exhaustion and relief. David knelt beside the paramedics, helping to lift Kira onto a stretcher, murmuring encouragements as though they were words of comfort after 2 decades of silence. Not far off, reporters gathered at the edge of the tape line, their cameras and microphones poised. Scanner chatter had already alerted local stations to the breaking news, a major breakthrough in one of the Southwest's longest-running missing persons cases. Holbrook saw their approach and raised a gloved hand. "No media here," he barked, then turned back to Marissa. "We'll transfer you all to the medical unit at Chandler General, where you'll be safe and April and the others can receive proper care. After that, we'll need detailed statements from everyone." Marissa nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you all." As the paramedics guided the survivors into the ambulances, Marissa and David shared a final look with April, a silent vow that they would not rest until Amber's fate was fully uncovered and until justice had been exacted upon those who had hidden the truth for so long. Then, flanked by Detective Holbrook and Chris Delaney, they climbed into the unmarked car that would carry them to the hospital, and finally, toward the answers they had waited 20 years to hear. Detective Holbrook stepped into the small interview room, carrying a tray laden with cups of water and a box of tissues. His face was drawn and tense after the long hours of orchestrating the rescue operation, but his eyes shone with resolve. Placing a cup in front of each of them, he announced, "We've established roadblocks on every major route out of the county. Caraway won't be going anywhere." David, voice tight with concern, asked, "Has he already fled?" Holbrook's jaw tightened. "His house was emptied out this morning. The closets, all the personal effects, gone. He must have bolted the moment he left the station. But don't worry, we'll catch him." He turned his attention to April, whose emerald eyes met his with quiet courage. "April," he said gently, "I know this must feel overwhelming, but we need you to tell us everything about what happened on that terrible night in 1995 and about the years that followed. Can you do that?" April swallowed and nodded. "I want him caught," she replied, her voice steadier than it had been in the bunker below the ranch. She inhaled deeply. "My name is April Michelle Green. I was abducted on May 17th, 1995, along with my twin sister Amber and 4 other girls from our cheerleading squad. Detective Holbrook clicked the recording device on and placed it between them. "Thank you," he said. "Please tell us what occurred that night." April closed her eyes for a moment, remembering. We had just finished our routine in the regional championships. We were all celebrating in the locker room, changing and joking about heading home. Coach Caraway asked Rachel Collins to stay behind for a private chat about her performance. The rest of us left to buy sodas across the street. She paused, swallowing. When we returned, we found Coach Caraway in the storage room with Rachel, touching her inappropriately. Rachel was crying, but he told her it was fine, that she was special, that she'd be his sole wife, and he'd make her a star. When he saw us standing there, he told us it was nothing, that Rachel was merely upset by a mistake in her routine, and he was comforting her. Marissa tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, giving her strength. Detective Holbrook waited patiently before prompting, "And then?" April's voice broke as she continued. "Lily Rivera said we should report it to our parents or the principal. Coach Caraway became furious. He stormed out and returned with 3 men, the same men we later saw at the ranch. They had syringes. They forced us onto that bench and injected us with something. I felt dizzy, and everything went black. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the bunker under the ranch, with all 6 of us there." Tears welled in Marissa's eyes. Rachel told us Coach Caraway had been grooming other girls, promising them special training and professional careers if they became his so-called sole wives, April added, her face pale. Some believed him and went along. But after the abduction, Detective Holbrook leaned forward. "What happened after you were taken?" April's jaw clenched. "We thought we'd be rescued quickly. Our parents would search, the police would find us. But days turned into weeks, months, years. Coach Caraway visited often, taking one of us each time. Laffinger and Matthew Rands oversaw day-to-day operations, food, basic care, total isolation." Her voice hollowed. "Rachel got sick about 5 years ago, high fever, infections. We begged them to take her to a doctor, but they refused. She died down there, alone." Marissa pressed a tissue to her lips, fighting her own tears. Detective Holbrook's voice was soft. "And Amber?" April drew a shaky breath. 3 years ago, Amber and Lily discovered that one of the guards left his keycard unattended. We planned our escape. In the dead of night, we made a break for it. We almost reached the barn doors when the alarm sounded. Guards flooded in. Amber and Lily were at the front. Coach Caraway was enraged. He said he needed to make an example of them to keep us in line. April paused, eyes brimming. He strangled them in front of us. If any of us tried to escape again, he said, the same fate would await. Her voice cracked on the final syllable. David's face was ashen. Marissa reached across the table, covering April's hand with her own. Detective Holbrook nodded gravely. "And the ranch itself, what was its purpose beyond your captivity?" April's eyes darkened. "Money laundering, I believe. We overheard talk about shipments, distribution routes, drug trafficking. Caraway's company, CPF, was just a front." David's brow furrowed. "That explains the daily catering deliveries." Holbrook made more notes. "We'll pursue those leads. The FBI is on its way. This falls under their jurisdiction." He looked back to April. "Earlier, you mentioned the earrings your mother gave you. Do you know how one ended up with the diner waitress?" April nodded. "After Amber and Lily were killed, Matthew Rands took their earrings. He kept one as a trophy and later gave the other to that waitress." Marissa's hand flew to her mouth. "What about the cheerleading uniforms?" Holbrook asked. "Why were they buried recently?" April's shoulders shook. "A few weeks ago, Caraway and Laffinger argued over evidence. He wanted to destroy anything linking him to us. So they buried the uniforms in the desert, thinking no one would ever find them. By now, the sky beyond the station's windows had darkened. Holbrook leaned back, exhaustion tugging at his features, but determination clear in his eyes. "Thank you, April. We'll need more statements in the coming days, but this is a tremendous start. Tomorrow the FBI will speak with you, and we'll arrange safe accommodations." Marissa exhaled shakily. "What comes next?" Holbrook smiled gently. "First, a medical check at the hospital. You all deserve proper care. Then we'll secure your privacy. This story will draw intense media attention." His radio crackled, and his expression brightened. "We've got him," he announced. "Highway Patrol intercepted Caraway trying to cross into New Mexico about 30 minutes ago. He's being brought back to Chandler now." Relief washed over Marissa. They would finally see Caraway behind bars. "There's more," Holbrook added. "On Laffinger Ranch, we've uncovered financial records tying Caraway, Laffinger, and Rands to large-scale drug operations. The cheerleading and fitness fronts were just covers." April closed her eyes. "I always suspected as much," she whispered. As they rose to leave, the diner waitress appeared at the door, escorted by an officer. Her eyes were red from crying. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "If I'd known." Marissa stepped forward and embraced her. "You saved our daughter's life," she insisted, pressing April's matching earring into the waitress's hand. "Please, keep it as a reminder of what you helped us overcome." The waitress shook her head, tears falling. "It belongs to your family," she handed it back. Outside the interview room, other reunions unfolded. Kira with her parents, Linda and Robert Thompson clinging to each other in joyous tears. Hannah Lee tearfully embraced by her father, Michael, remembering Judith, her mother, who had died 3 years earlier, never knowing her daughter was alive. In the station's main hall, officers gently informed Susan Collins and the Riveras that their daughters had not survived. Their anguished cries cut through the bustle, a poignant reminder of lives still lost. April paused in the doorway, watching the grieving parents. "I wish I could have saved them," she murmured. David pulled her close. "You survived, sweetheart. That means their stories will live on, and those responsible will be held to account." Marissa wrapped her arms around April. After 20 years of emptiness, their daughter was finally home, and though the road ahead would be long with healing and justice still to come, they had at last begun to turn the page on a chapter that had once seemed impossible to close.